Let me ask you something. What if the pain you're feeling from their betrayal isn't the end, but the beginning of your transformation? What if everything you're going through right now, the silence, the confusion, the anger, isn't a setback, but a setup? You've been lied to. Not just by them, but by a culture that tells you to chase closure, to seek revenge, to prove your worth to the very person who broke your trust. And the worst part? Many of us believe that unless they suffer visibly, justice hasn't been served. But what if I told you there's a better way, one that doesn't require a single word from you, not 1 ounce of revenge, and yet delivers consequences so real, so piercing, they'll feel it every time they sit in silence? That's the quiet, powerful truth you're about to discover. You see, betrayal is often misunderstood. It's not just a violation of trust, it's a disruption of the moral structure of reality. And when that's disrupted, the universe responds. Stoicism teaches us not to chase outcomes, but to become the kind of person who can stand unshaken by them. This approach doesn't just offer peace. It delivers a form of justice that's deeper, quieter, and far more devastating than revenge. It's the Stoic Relationships principle. Those who betray love, loyalty, and truth don't walk away clean. They walk away with a debt, one they carry in silence, one that compounds every day they pretend they're unaffected. So here's the problem. You've been taught to think your healing depends on their apology, your peace depends on their remorse, and your worth depends on their recognition. But that's not just wrong, it's dangerous. Because it keeps you tethered to their actions instead of your own growth. What if your healing didn't need their remorse? What if the most powerful form of justice isn't external, but internal? Not through confrontation, but transformation? Imagine realizing that you never had to fight to be seen. You just had to stop dimming your light for those who were blind to it. This isn't about bitterness. It's about clarity. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And the truth is, their betrayal will cost them, and you won't have to lift a finger. As we move forward, I'm going to show you how. We'll explore the silent unraveling of those who betray, how guilt morphs into internal chaos, and why your growth, your indifference, your peace, are the loudest echoes of justice they'll ever hear. Stay with me, because the next part 1, unmasks the illusion they're living in, and why that illusion is already starting to crack. 1. The illusion of escape. They thought they were free. That walking away without explanation, without remorse, somehow absolved them. They convinced themselves that silence was strength and avoidance was peace. They even believed that betraying you, whether through lies, emotional manipulation, or abandonment, was a form of liberation, as if cutting ties with someone who loved them genuinely would unshackle them from some invisible burden. But here's the truth they can't outrun. Their betrayal came with a price tag. And that price doesn't come in the form of revenge or public humiliation, it comes silently, gradually, from the inside out. At first, they feel the rush. The relief of avoidance. The high of a new distraction. The satisfaction of imagined control. But that's all it is, an illusion. An illusion that Stoicism strips bare. Because when a person acts against what is true, against someone who gave with no agenda, loved without games, and stayed loyal when it wasn't convenient, the universe doesn't let that slide. Not because you demand it, but because reality is structured in a way that rewards integrity and punishes deception. That's the part they don't see at first. They mistake the silence for peace, the distance for healing, the distractions for progress. But underneath it, something else begins to grow, guilt. Not the loud, dramatic kind. No. The subtle, creeping kind. The one that shows up when they least expect it. When they meet someone new and hesitate to trust. When they wake up in the middle of the night with a weight on their chest. When they laugh and feel the hollowness underneath. That's the price beginning to unfold. And it's a debt they can't outsource or delay. They told themselves a story. That you were the problem, that their actions were justified, that they needed to protect their peace. But peace built on betrayal isn't peace. It's avoidance in disguise. How do you escape something that lives in your own conscience? That's the question they can't answer. They believed walking away without honesty or courage would erase the consequences. But Stoic relationships don't work that way. Truth has a long memory. And when someone betrays a good heart, they don't sever a connection, they sever part of their own moral structure. They believed the absence of confrontation meant the absence of consequences. But your silence didn't free them, it started the process of decay. Because when someone is confronted by your stillness, by your refusal to beg or plead or chase, they are forced to sit with the one voice they can't silence, their own. That voice doesn't yell. It whispers. And over time, those whispers become unbearable. Stoicism teaches us not to control others, but to control ourselves. And in that self-control, in choosing dignity over drama, you handed them over to reality. And reality is far more exacting than you could ever be. They thought they escaped the courtroom, but the trial was always internal. Every future relationship becomes tainted by the memory of what they did. Every moment of stillness becomes haunted by what they destroyed. Because when someone walks away from truth, they don't find freedom. They find fragmentation. A subtle fracture in the soul. One that no amount of newness or noise can repair. And the irony is, they don't even realize it at first. They keep moving. Posting. Smiling. Laughing. Pretending. But the body keeps score. The psyche remembers. And eventually, the illusion begins to crack. It might be months. It might be years. But it always happens. Because you can't violate trust and expect to remain whole. You can't betray someone real and expect reality to reward you. This is not karma in the mystical sense, it's psychological law. You see, Stoic relationships are built on the understanding that character matters more than convenience. That presence matters more than performance. That showing up with integrity, especially when things get hard, is the true test of who someone is. And they failed that test. Not because you demanded perfection, but because they fled from honesty. They chose the easier path, the one paved with denial, detachment, and distraction. But easy paths don't lead to peace. They lead to decay. At first, they feel powerful. Like they're finally in control. But control gained through betrayal is never real. It's borrowed. And the interest compounds daily. That's why they can't relax. That's why something always feels off. That's why no matter how much validation they chase, it never lands. Because when you betray someone who would have walked through fire for you, you betray the part of yourself capable of true connection. That's the irony, they didn't break you. They broke themselves. They cut off the lifeline to something stabilizing, grounding, real. And now they drift. Smiling in public, unsettled in private. Surrounded by people, but haunted in silence. Because something sacred was lost, and they were the ones who destroyed it. They thought they were escaping you. But what they were really escaping was themselves. And the further they run, the louder the echoes become. That moment they lied. That time they looked into your eyes and chose selfishness. It plays on loop in their subconscious. Because you can't bury the truth forever. It has roots. It grows in the dark. And when it blooms, it reveals everything they tried to hide, even from themselves. The illusion of escape is powerful, but temporary. And when it fades, they are left with the reality of what they did. Not just to you, but to themselves. That's the price. That's the beginning of their reckoning. And you? You didn't have to lift a finger. You didn't fight. You didn't scream. You just stood still. And in doing so, you became the mirror they can't avoid. Because every attempt they make to move forward forces them to confront the shadow of what they left behind. That's the cost of betrayal. Not public shame, but private collapse. Not dramatic consequences, but slow, silent unraveling. You don't have to wish them harm. Life handles that. The truth has its own gravity. And it always pulls us back to what we tried to escape. Especially when what we escaped was someone who loved us without armor, without games, with nothing but sincerity. That's the real escape they attempted. To flee from accountability, from vulnerability, from the discomfort of facing what they were not ready to be. And that is why their escape is an illusion. Because you cannot escape yourself. You cannot outrun the voice that knows what you did. And eventually, when the noise fades and the distractions wear thin, that voice will be all they have left. A voice that says, you had something real, and you threw it away. 2. The internal price of deception. There's a cost that doesn't show up on the surface. It doesn't scream or make a scene. It doesn't show up in public arguments or dramatic confrontations. It creeps in silently, like fog rolling through the soul, gradually dimming the light of one's inner world. This is the internal price of deception. And it's the price they are already paying, whether they admit it or not. Because betrayal isn't just about hurting someone else, it's about fracturing one's own capacity to be whole. At first, it seems small. A shrug. A sense of relief. A rationalization. I did what I had to do. They weren't right for me. I owe them nothing. And for a while, those stories work. But only on the surface. Deep down, a different voice begins to rise, the voice that knows the truth. The voice that speaks when the noise fades and the performances are over. The voice of conscience. You see, when someone betrays a person who was genuine, who loved with clarity, who offered their heart without pretense, they don't just betray another, they betray the part of themselves capable of love. And love, real love, is not disposable. It's not casual. It's not convenient. It requires responsibility. It requires presence. And when someone proves they are incapable of holding that, of honoring that, they don't walk away powerful. They walk away fractured. That fracture might not show immediately. But Stoicism reminds us, things unfold in due time, not our time. The seeds of betrayal they planted will bear fruit, not in the form of retribution, but in the form of emotional and spiritual decay. Why? Because you cannot lie to yourself forever. You cannot live in contradiction with your own values and expect to be at peace. And that's exactly what betrayal creates, a contradiction. They said they cared. They said they'd stay. They acted like you mattered. And then they vanished, lied, twisted the truth, or manipulated. That contradiction embeds itself like a splinter in the psyche. Every new interaction, every new connection, triggers the echo of what they did. They begin to doubt themselves, not because others are untrustworthy, but because they remember what they're capable of when things get uncomfortable. This is not a punishment, it's a consequence. A natural outcome. Just as a wound left untreated begins to rot, a soul that lives in deceit begins to corrode. That corrosion manifests in countless ways. Restlessness. Anxiety. Guilt that appears as agitation. Shame that disguises itself as detachment. Emotional numbing that masquerades as independence. And worst of all, a loss of trust in their own ability to be genuine. When they look in the mirror, they see someone who failed to be strong when it mattered. Who took the easy way out. Who chose self-interest over sincerity. And that image haunts them. Not all at once. Not in dramatic bursts. But slowly, constantly, in quiet moments they can't escape. That's the internal price. Not paid in cash or confrontation. Paid in emotional erosion. In the loneliness that lingers even in a crowd. In the inability to form real bonds because they fear being seen clearly, the way you once saw them. That clarity is gone now. Not because you stopped seeing them, but because they stopped deserving to be seen by you. They destroyed the bridge. And now they wander. From person to person. Moment to moment. Searching for something that feels like you, but not quite. Because here's the truth they can't admit, they felt safest with you. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. Stoic relationships are grounded in presence, in self-awareness, in inner responsibility. When someone betrays that, they step outside of order. And order always reasserts itself. Not with thunder. With echoes. They hear your name and flinch. They see someone who reminds them of you and feel the sting. They try to explain it away, but deep down, they know. That knowing becomes heavy. They carry it into every room, every connection, every quiet night. And no matter how much they try to reframe the past, the truth doesn't budge. It just waits. Waits for them to slow down. Waits for them to get quiet. Waits for them to stop pretending. And then it speaks. You lost something good. You broke something sacred. You became the kind of person you once swore you never would. This internal reckoning is not poetic. It's biological, psychological, existential. It's how we're wired. Human beings are not built to thrive in deception. When we act against our values, we suffer. Maybe not right away, but eventually. And when someone wounds a heart that was good to them, they suffer in ways they can't name. That's the weight they now carry. While you rebuild. While you reflect. While you rise. Because your healing is not just for you. It's a message. A mirror. A monument to what they could have had, if they had chosen integrity. But they didn't. And now, every moment of your growth is a silent reminder of the cost they never calculated. And that cost is climbing. Every day. Every night. Their inner world becomes less stable. Their joy feels thinner. Their victories feel emptier. Because when you win through betrayal, you don't win peace. You win paranoia. Suspicion. Detachment. They might laugh louder now, post more confidently, act as if they've upgraded. But inside? There's an echo they can't silence. It says, "You hurt someone who never wanted to hurt you. And now you don't even recognize yourself." That's not revenge. That's reality. And it doesn't need your help. Life handles the internal consequences. Stoicism reminds us to let go of what we can't control. You're not here to punish them. You're here to rebuild you. And as you do, they're left to sit with the version of themselves they tried to become. A version that pretends. A version that hides. A version that looks whole, but feels broken. This is the cost of deception. The erosion of self-respect. The inability to sleep peacefully. The fragmentation of identity. And all of it, every single consequence, is internal. You don't have to lift a finger. Just become better. Stronger. Clearer. And as you do, the contrast becomes unbearable. Because you carry peace. And they carry guilt. You carry clarity. And they carry confusion. You carry truth. And they carry the weight of their own lie. That's the price. And it is always paid. Now if this resonates, if you're feeling that quiet strength returning, go ahead and like this video and comment, number 1, down below to let us know you're on this journey too. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started. The next part? It's where everything shifts. Where your silence becomes their sentence. Where your dignity becomes their mirror. Stay with me. 3. Your silence becomes the verdict. There's a particular kind of silence that isn't born from weakness, but from power. The kind that says more than words ever could. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice, because its presence alone carries the weight of truth. And when you've been betrayed, when someone you trusted turns their back without remorse, your silence becomes the verdict they never saw coming. See, in Stoicism, silence is not passivity. It is mastery. It is the conscious refusal to be dragged into the chaos created by someone else's lack of integrity. You didn't react, not because you didn't feel, but because you refused to let their actions dictate your state. That kind of strength isn't loud, it's disciplined. And that discipline reverberates through the very person who tried to harm you. They expected rage, drama, confrontation. They were ready to paint you as unhinged, obsessive, unstable. But instead, you did the one thing they couldn't anticipate: you vanished. You moved in silence. And that silence told the entire story? Because silence, when anchored in dignity, becomes a reflection of your value. And when they look into that silence, they're forced to face the only judge that matters, their own conscience. That's the punishment they never planned for. It's easy to dismiss someone who begs, to demonize someone who argues, to dehumanize someone who reacts. But how do you explain someone who just disappears? Someone who doesn't chase, doesn't explain, doesn't try to reclaim what you threw away? That silence is haunting. It leaves a void. A question mark. It creates a space where they must confront the full impact of their choices without a buffer. Your absence doesn't just remove you from their life, it removes the illusion they used to justify their betrayal. No longer can they say, "They needed too much," or "They were unstable," or "They made me feel trapped." Because now you're gone. Fully. Quietly. Completely. And all they're left with is the weight of what they lost, and why. That silence grows louder with time. At first, they may revel in it, mistaking it for freedom. But eventually it turns into something else. It becomes the void they can't fill. Not with new people. Not with shallow victories. Not with distractions. Because your silence becomes synonymous with consequence. It doesn't fade. It echoes. In every pause. In every memory. In every failed attempt to replicate what you gave so effortlessly. And that echo becomes unbearable, because it forces them to acknowledge the one thing they've been avoiding: you didn't need them. You didn't collapse. You didn't chase. You didn't try to fix what they chose to break. You simply withdrew. And that withdrawal wasn't weakness, it was a sentence. A declaration. A final chapter. Not of revenge, but of evolution. Your silence became their mirror. And what they saw in it wasn't your pain, it was their cowardice. Their betrayal. Their smallness. And they can't unsee it. That's why Stoic relationships are so potent, because they don't rely on emotional noise to validate their worth. They rest in presence, in clarity, in the quiet strength of self-respect. When someone walks away from that, they think they're in control. But they've actually relinquished control over the one thing that matters most: how they will remember themselves. Because long after the excitement fades, long after the attention shifts, they're left with the version of themselves that chose deceit over honesty, games over growth, ego over empathy. And the reminder of that choice is etched into your absence. Every time they feel disconnected, they remember the person who offered real connection. Every time they feel unstable, they remember the one who grounded them. Every time they feel unseen, they remember the one who saw them fully and loved them anyway. And yet, they walked away. That knowledge doesn't go away. It settles in the background, always there. And every attempt they make to distract themselves from it only reinforces its presence. That's the irony of betrayal. The one who walks away often becomes more haunted than the one left behind. Because they carry the burden of choice. And choice has memory. The mind replays our moments of cowardice. Our choices made in fear. Our actions taken in selfishness. It doesn't erase them. It preserves them. And when those choices involve hurting someone real, someone grounded, someone true, the regret becomes more than emotional. It becomes existential. Who am I, if I could do that to someone who loved me? That's the question they can't answer. That's the question your silence forces them to ask. And they will ask it. Not once. Not loudly. But over and over again, in the quiet. Because the quiet is where truth lives. Not in debates. Not in conflict. In silence. And when you give them that silence, you give them their own mind. Their own conscience. Their own mirror. They expected your presence to be permanent. They treated your consistency like a given. But now it's gone. Not because you vanished into bitterness, but because you grew into wisdom. And wisdom doesn't chase. It watches. It listens. It lets time do the teaching. You see, Stoicism doesn't demand justice. It trusts in it. And that trust is what allowed you to stay silent. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about your future self not to stay entangled in lies. You gave them the gift of your withdrawal. And now, that gift is wrapped in silence they can't unwrap. It stays closed. Untouched. Mysterious. Heavy. That's the verdict. That's the sentence. Not spoken. But lived. And it plays out not in fireworks, but in comparisons. They meet someone new, and measure them against you. They try to feel peace, but it doesn't land the way it did with you. They try to laugh, but the joy feels thinner. Why? Because your presence was real. Their betrayal was real. And now the absence is real. And the mind can't deny that trifecta forever. Eventually it breaks through. Maybe in a therapy session. Maybe in a random conversation. Maybe in the stillness of a sleepless night. But it breaks through. And when it does, they're faced with one conclusion: they did this to themselves. You didn't ruin them. They ruined something sacred. And now they live with the silence left behind. You see, silence is powerful because it removes excuses. It leaves them nowhere to hide. No drama to distract. No argument to resist. Just the truth. And the truth is, they chose this. They chose betrayal. They chose to walk away from something steady for something shallow. They chose to trade meaning for ego. And now they're paying for it, not through your hands, but through their own mind. Through the slow unraveling of every lie they told themselves. That's why silence is not the absence of justice, it's the essence of it. Because it gives them back to themselves. And when someone knows deep down that they destroyed something that was meant to nurture them, they don't need a courtroom. They already live in one. Every decision, every interaction, every memory becomes evidence. And the verdict? It's already written. Not in your words, but in their regret. A regret that compounds with time, with growth, with distance. And the more you rise, the more your life becomes a testimony. A living witness to what they gave up. Not in anger, not in revenge, in silence. And that silence speaks louder than any speech ever could. 4. The inescapable comparison. There's a moment they didn't prepare for, the moment after betrayal, when the dust settles and they try to move on. They enter something new. A new connection, a new conversation, a new face smiling back at them. And at first, it feels like a reset, like freedom. But then, something subtle begins to rise. It's not regret at first. It's memory. A scent. A word. A pattern. And suddenly, they're not just seeing this new person, they're seeing you. Not because they want to, but because the mind doesn't delete what the soul once recognized. The contrast begins quietly. A difference in tone, in presence, in peace. They laugh, but it doesn't land the same. They open up, but it doesn't feel as safe. They start to wonder why it's not clicking, not flowing, not forming the way it once did. And that's when the inescapable comparison begins. Because when you betray someone real, someone rooted in authenticity, you don't just lose them. You lose your ability to pretend that shallow replacements will satisfy a deep wound. That's what Stoic relationships reveal. The absence of noise brings clarity. And now, they have no choice but to see it clearly. You were rare. You were present. You didn't perform, you connected. You didn't manipulate, you held space. You didn't seek attention, you offered loyalty. And that's not something they can just find again. Not in apps. Not in flings. Not in the next person who says the right thing at the right time. Because what you gave wasn't just attention, it was resonance. And resonance is unforgettable. So now, every new moment they try to recreate something with someone else becomes haunted by the memory of what was lost. Not because you're clinging to the past, but because they are trapped in it. Trapped in a loop they created with their own hands. They thought they were walking towards something better, something more exciting, something more aligned with who they think they are. But the further they walk from you, the more their new experiences reflect what they left behind. And that reflection is not kind. It reminds them that while they were chasing validation, they already had value. That while they were seeking ease, they gave up depth. That while they were trying to feel powerful, they destroyed the only place they were truly seen. And now, that destruction becomes a standard. A measuring stick. A haunting. They say they've moved on, but why do they still compare? Why do they still flinch when your name comes up? Why does your presence still linger in the background of their new reality? Because they can't fake peace. They can't pretend joy. Not for long. The body doesn't lie. The nervous system remembers. The mind catalogs what mattered. And no matter how much they try to erase it, the truth remains: you were the calm in their chaos. And now that calm is gone. And they're left with noise. Noise in their heart. In their mind. In their choices. And the more they chase what feels different, the more they realize what they lost was never ordinary. It was extraordinary. And they threw it away. That realization doesn't crash in. It creeps in. Slowly. Consistently. Like water over stone. Until one day, they're sitting with someone who checks every superficial box, and yet they feel nothing. No depth. No grounding. No truth. Just a void. And in that void, your image reappears. Not as someone who hurt them, but as someone they hurt. Not as someone they needed to escape, but as someone they wish they could return to. But it's too late. Because once you step into self-respect, into clarity, into stoicism, you don't go back to what betrayed you. You rise. And your rise creates the contrast they can't escape. You become the mirror they keep encountering in others. Every shortfall in a new connection reminds them of the depth they once had. Every misalignment echoes your presence. Every lack of authenticity screams for what they walked away from. That's the inescapable comparison. It lives in silence. In glances. In quiet moments they can't explain. And it grows. Not because you're chasing them, but because you're no longer available. You've shifted from being someone they could access to someone they only remember. And memory, when tied to guilt, becomes torment. They tell themselves it was necessary. That they made the right call. That you were too much, too little, too intense, too sensitive. But their body knows. Their dreams know. Their triggers know. Because regret doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just lingers. Stoicism doesn't celebrate revenge. It celebrates truth. And the truth is, you gave them something real. And now, they measure everything against it. And nothing measures up. Not in tone. Not in energy. Not in soul. And they start to wonder if they'll ever feel that again. But the truth is, they won't. Not until they face themselves. Not until they stop running. Not until they admit that the problem wasn't you. It was their inability to receive what they asked for. And that admission is heavy. It's devastating. Because it means that every shallow high they chased, every distraction they prioritized, every moment they justified their betrayal, was a step away from the very thing they needed. And that step can't be undone. Not when you've grown. Not when you've healed. Not when you've embodied what Stoic relationships demand: clarity, boundary, dignity. And so they spiral. Slowly. Silently. Smiling in photos. Hollow in presence. Because every new connection is shadowed by the old one, the one they discarded thinking there'd be another just like it. But there won't be. Because you were never common. And now they know that. Every time they compare, every time they flinch, every time they wonder why it's not landing the way it used to, that's your echo. Not your presence, but your absence. Not your words, but your silence. Not your pursuit, but your evolution. That's why the comparison hurts. Because it's not just about who they're with now. It's about who they had to become in order to justify losing you. And that version of them? It doesn't feel whole. It feels hollow. Misaligned. Shaky. And that instability becomes a companion. They carry it. Into every room. Into every bond. Into every opportunity they once prayed for. And it follows them. Because truth isn't something you outrun. It's something you either face or are consumed by. And they chose to avoid it. But now it's here. And it wears your face. Not as punishment, but as a reminder. You can't build happiness on betrayal. You can't replace soul with aesthetics. You can't fake depth with charm. And when they tried, they discovered the truth the hard way. That comparison isn't a choice. It's a consequence. A natural result of betraying something they never thought they'd lose. And now, they feel it. Fully. Constantly. Because Stoicism doesn't ask for payback. It reveals the weight of decisions through contrast. And contrast is relentless. It doesn't need your help, just your growth. So if this hit home, if you felt that quiet inner strength rising as you listened, like this video and comment. Number 1, if you're ready to stop comparing and start living your truth. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep, grounded insights like this. Because we're only halfway through the journey, and the next part is where you begin to rise in ways they never imagined. Stay tuned. 5. The rise they didn't expect. What they anticipated was collapse. That's what people often assume will happen when they betray someone who loved them without reservation. They thought you'd spiral, that you'd break, that you'd fall into a pit of neediness and longing, chasing for answers they were never courageous enough to give. They expected the betrayal to crush you, to reduce you to a version of yourself that clings, begs, pleads for closure. But what they didn't anticipate, what they never saw coming, was your rise. Because while they were busy projecting their own weakness onto you, you were quietly rebuilding. Not out of vengeance. Not to prove anything. But because that's what strong souls do. They regenerate. They reflect. They reset. They grow. Stoicism teaches that adversity is not a curse, but a catalyst. And betrayal, as brutal as it is, becomes one of life's most potent catalysts for evolution. The version of you that emerged wasn't born out of spite. It was forged in silence, in pain, in deep introspection. While they distracted themselves with shallow highs and surface-level victories, you were learning. Learning about your worth. Learning where your boundaries were too soft. Learning how to love without abandoning yourself. And that kind of learning? It sticks. It transforms. It sharpens. They believed they were walking away from someone who needed them. But in truth, they were walking away from someone who was about to become everything they could never reach again. Your glow-up wasn't about appearances. It was about energy, presence, depth. The way you stopped flinching at their name. The way you no longer tolerated confusion. The way you became selective with your time, your heart, your peace. And it wasn't a performance. It was an embodiment. Because real healing isn't loud, it's lived. They scroll past your life now, watching from a distance, pretending not to care. But deep down, they feel it. That discomfort. That subtle, gnawing sensation that tells them they missed something sacred. And that realization doesn't hit all at once. It arrives in waves. The first wave is disbelief. They don't understand how you're okay. How you're not posting cryptic messages, not chasing their shadow, not engaging in the emotional warfare they expected. Then comes confusion. Why are you thriving? Why are you attracting peace? Why does your energy feel lighter while theirs feels heavier? That confusion turns into contrast. And contrast is the teacher they never asked for. Because every moment you rise is a mirror to their stagnation. Every step forward you take is a spotlight on how stuck they feel. And that spotlight doesn't fade. It follows them. Into new relationships, into late-night thoughts, into every moment they try to feel proud of their choices. Because no matter how much they try to reframe the story, they know the truth. You didn't just survive, you became someone they no longer have access to. That's the devastation they didn't plan for. They thought the betrayal would define you. But instead, it refined you. They thought you'd become bitter. But you became better. They thought you'd crumble in their absence. But instead, you created space. Space for clarity. Space for self-respect. Space for your true self to emerge. You see, growth is not always glamorous. It's not always packaged in perfect mantras or clean timelines. Sometimes, growth is raw, lonely, confusing. But it's in those very moments, when you refuse to become what they accused you of being, that you found your strength. And now that strength radiates. Not because you shout it, but because you embody it. You walk into rooms differently now. You speak with more intention. You no longer chase what feels unstable. And that shift? It's magnetic. It pulls in new energy, new people, new opportunities that align with your truth. Meanwhile, they remain in patterns, repeating dynamics, chasing distractions, seeking in others what they once discarded in you. But nothing feels right. Because when you betray a grounded presence, a sincere heart, a loyal soul, what you're really betraying is your access to peace. And peace can't be faked. It can't be replaced with parties or applause. Peace is quiet. And so is regret. And now they sit with both. Regret for what they broke. And envy for how you built. Not a loud, bitter envy, but a quiet, persistent one. The kind that watches you from the shadows, knowing they no longer have the right to reach out. They want to. At times, they think about it. Crafting messages. Rehearsing apologies. But something stops them. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's pride. Or maybe it's the awareness that the person they knew, the one they once dismissed, no longer exists. Because that person evolved. Transcended. Moved forward without needing validation. And that's the punishment they never imagined, that their betrayal created your liberation. That by leaving, they opened the door for your transformation. And that transformation is a life sentence, not for you, but for them. Because while you found alignment, they're stuck in avoidance. While you grew into your values, they shrank into their vices. While you faced your pain, they ran from theirs. And now, the gap between who you are and who they are becoming grows wider by the day. That's the cost they never calculated. Not just the loss of you, but the loss of who they could have been if they had stayed. If they had chosen honesty, integrity, courage. But they didn't. And now, you live in a different reality. One that doesn't revolve around them. One that doesn't seek approval. One that is quiet, and full, and whole. And that kind of life? It echoes. Every time they feel disconnected, they think of you. Every time they hear your name, something stirs. Not nostalgia. Not longing. But a painful clarity. You were not their stepping stone. You were their mischance. Their unrecognized gift. Their turning point. And while they spiraled in denial, you rose in discipline. In resilience. In stoic clarity. Because stoicism isn't about detachment. It's about discernment. It's not about avoiding emotion. It's about aligning with what is true. And what is true is this: you grew. Not because they left. But because you chose not to stay where you weren't valued. You chose not to shrink. You chose not to become bitter. You chose your future over their confusion. And now, your life is the evidence of that choice. They see it. They feel it. And deep down, they know they will never be the same. Because once you witness someone rising from the ruins you caused, you don't forget that image. It lives in you, haunts you, teaches you. And for them, that lesson is just beginning. 6. The spiritual laws at work. There's a structure to life, not just physical or psychological, but moral and spiritual, a framework that transcends culture, language, and personal bias. It's the structure that holds the invisible fabric of relationships, honor, and trust together. And when someone betrays another, especially a person who is true, kind, and committed, they're not just making a mistake, they're disrupting that structure. They're breaking a spiritual law. They may not see it at the time. To them, betrayal may seem like a strategy. A way to feel powerful, to escape discomfort, to reclaim freedom. They might tell themselves they're being honest by choosing themselves, that they had to break free, that they owed no one anything. But those justifications are surface level. They don't penetrate the deeper layers of reality where the consequences of our actions take root. Because underneath all the ego-driven narratives lies the truth. When you betray what is good, when you violate trust without remorse, the world doesn't let it slide. Not in ways that are always visible, but in ways that are inevitable. It's not about superstition. It's about alignment. And when a person chooses betrayal, they step out of alignment with what is good, noble, and meaningful. And once you're out of alignment, everything feels off. The joy doesn't land. The peace doesn't last. The victories feel hollow. Relationships feel like performances instead of connections. That's the cost that Stoicism points to, not punishment, but misalignment. And misalignment manifests as restlessness, discontent, instability. They walk through life carrying this invisible weight. They try to shake it, outrun it, bury it in distraction. But it follows. Because betrayal is not just an act, it's a shift in spiritual posture. It changes how they relate to the world, to others, and to themselves. When you betray someone who offered their loyalty without condition, their love without manipulation, their presence without performance, you're not just damaging another person. You're damaging your own capacity to connect with truth. And without truth, nothing holds. Without integrity, no relationship thrives. Without honor, even success feels shallow. That's the tragedy they're beginning to realize. They thought they were choosing excitement. They thought they were upgrading. They thought they were claiming independence. But what they actually did was sever a lifeline to meaning. They fractured their connection to something sacred. And sacred things, once broken, don't regenerate through shortcuts. You can't patch a soul with distractions. You can't numb a moral wound with indulgence. You can't replace integrity with charm. They may try. Oh, how they try. They dive into new relationships, throw themselves into work, flood their schedule with stimulation. But the ache is still there. Because the spiritual law has been broken. And life, reality, always seeks to restore balance. Not through vengeance, but through consequences that unfold slowly, unavoidably. That's why everything starts to feel unstable. Why new people feel more like comparisons than fresh starts. Why moments of silence become moments of reckoning. Why the past doesn't stay in the past, but follows them like a shadow. They begin to realize that the betrayal wasn't strength, it was weakness. It wasn't empowerment, it was avoidance. It wasn't clarity, it was confusion disguised as certainty. And that confusion now lives inside them. It taints everything they touch. Because the universe is not chaotic. It's ordered. And that order demands integrity. Stoicism teaches us that living in accordance with nature means aligning with what is right, what is truthful, what is stable. When someone violates that, they begin to feel the natural discomfort of disconnection. That's the law at work. It doesn't care about appearances. It's not impressed by image. It's not swayed by rationalizations. It simply restores balance. Quietly. Consistently. Over time. And that restoration begins to cost them. Not in your tears. Not in your begging. But in their own dissonance. They wonder why their peace is fleeting. Why their joy feels counterfeit. Why they can't rest, even when they've moved on. It's because the spiritual cost of betrayal is paid in delayed awareness. In subtle regret. In comparison. In the inability to experience depth again. Because they didn't just break trust, they broke the part of themselves that once knew how to honor it. That kind of fracture doesn't announce itself. It festers. It influences. It becomes the undercurrent of every choice, every new connection. And over time, they look back not with nostalgia, but with a heavy realization that what they left behind was not just a person, it was a path to something meaningful. And now, that path is closed. Not by force, but by consequence. Because you didn't need to block them. The universe did that for you. You didn't need to make them suffer. Their own soul is doing that now. You didn't need to wish them harm. Their own actions have created a future they now dread. One where they know the truth, but have no access to the one they hurt. That's how spiritual laws work. They don't punish. They reflect. And when someone stands in the reflection of who they could have been, who they betrayed, who they're becoming, there's no hiding. There's no escaping. Only truth. And truth, when denied for too long, becomes unbearable. That's what they're learning. Not through sermons. Not through speeches. Through experience. Through the silence that you left. Through the peace you reclaimed. Through the way your life now radiates something they can't find anywhere else. That's the echo of justice. Not loud. Not cruel. just present. Real. Unshakable. That's why they keep watching. Why they can't look away. Why they still react when your name surfaces. Because on some level, they still want what they walked away from. But it's too late. Not because you're punishing them, but because you've risen. You've stepped into a life built on truth, on stoic discipline, on emotional maturity. And that life has no room for betrayal, no room for manipulation, no room for someone who needed to destroy something beautiful in order to feel strong. You've outgrown the story. You've evolved beyond the dynamic. You've embodied what they thought they could take from you. And now they see it. They feel it. And they can't reach it. That's justice. Not in courtrooms. In consciousness. Not in fights. In contrast. Not in revenge. In revelation. So if you felt that quiet recognition as you listened, if your strength has been forged by silence, by growth, by unshakable clarity, like this video and comment, number 1, down below to affirm your own journey. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, because what comes next is the most powerful part of all, the conclusion, where everything that was broken becomes the foundation of something unshakable. There comes a moment, often quiet and solitary, when everything becomes clear, not to you, but to them. It doesn't arrive in the middle of a fight or in the aftermath of an argument. It arrives in stillness, in the silence that echoes long after you've withdrawn your energy, your love, your presence. It arrives when they least expect it, at a red light, in the pause between texts, when they catch their reflection or hear a song they forgot carried your memory. And in that moment, it hits them. Not just the fact that you're gone, but the depth of what that means. You were not just a relationship, a phase, a chapter. You were the mirror to their potential. You were the lighthouse in their emotional fog. You were the steady hand in a storm they didn't even know they were caught in. And they gave that up. They thought you were ordinary. They believed your loyalty was standard. That your patience could be found anywhere. That your emotional availability, your honesty, your presence were just traits anyone could offer. But time has taught them otherwise. Time has stripped away their illusions. What they chased, validation, novelty, escape, has all faded. The thrill of the new became a pattern. The distraction became noise. The attention they craved became hollow. Because none of it had your soul. None of it had the grounding force you carried effortlessly. And now, without even meaning to, they compare everything to what they lost. They start to see that no one listens the way you did. No one offers space the way you did. No one sees them with the same clarity. And that clarity, your clarity, is irreplaceable. Because it wasn't something you learned. It was something you lived. It came from your alignment with yourself, your willingness to be present, your refusal to manipulate or perform. You showed up raw, honest, whole. And they didn't know how to receive it. Not because you were too much, but because they were not enough yet. And instead of rising, instead of growing, instead of meeting you where you stood, they chose to run. To betray. To create distance where intimacy could have thrived. And now, the cost has caught up to them. Not in drama, but in distance. Not in conflict, but in contrast. Not because you've punished them, but because life has revealed the truth they refused to see. You were the gift they couldn't keep. And now you are the lesson they will never forget. That lesson lives in their nervous system. It pulses in their quietest moments. It weaves itself into their decisions, their relationships, their sense of self. They are not the same. They know more now, not just about you, but about what they're capable of. About the wounds they carry. About the selfishness they mistook for strength. About the emptiness they tried to fill by discarding something sacred. You taught them that love is not about ego. That loyalty is not a game. That truth, when mishandled, doesn't just disappear, it echoes. That the people we betray in haste often become the ghosts we long for in regret. But by the time this truth fully settles in, you are already gone. Not just physically, but energetically, spiritually, emotionally. You've transcended the version of yourself that tolerated confusion. You've evolved beyond the need to be understood by someone who refused to understand you. You don't look back, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. Because you now understand something vital: you are not defined by their actions. You are not reduced by their betrayal. You are not broken by their choices. You are built from something far deeper than their fleeting affection. What you gave was never small. It was profound. It was rooted in character, in Stoic values, in a desire to build something meaningful in a world obsessed with shallow validation. And now, that depth is your strength. That integrity is your anchor. That self-awareness is your compass. You don't need to prove anything. Your evolution speaks for itself. You've stopped seeking closure. You've stopped chasing narratives. You've stopped replaying the what-ifs. Because the only truth that matters is this: you showed up as your best self. And they didn't. And that distinction is not a weakness. It's a triumph. It's a separation between who clings to illusions and who rises in reality. And you? You chose reality. You chose discipline over chaos. Growth over resentment. Truth over temporary comfort. You embody Stoicism, not as a theory, but as a way of living. And that embodiment cannot be faked. It cannot be mimicked. It cannot be reached by someone still hiding from their own guilt. That's why they stay stuck. Not because you punished them, but because they never did the work. They never took responsibility. They never healed. They never faced the fact that what they called freedom was actually avoidance. That what they framed as empowerment was actually emotional cowardice. And so they circle back, not in your life, but in their mind, wondering what it would have been like if they had stayed. If they had told the truth. If they had chosen to grow with you, instead of away from you. But they'll never know. That version of reality is closed. And the only thing left is the memory. A memory that now acts as a reminder, a benchmark, a lost opportunity. You are no longer part of their story. But they will always remain a footnote in yours, a symbol of what you outgrew, a turning point in your journey, a chapter that taught you everything about who you are and what you will never tolerate again. And that's not bitterness. That's liberation. That's wisdom. That's Stoicism in action. Because real strength is not in revenge. It's in the refusal to be defined by pain. It's in the quiet decision to rebuild in peace, to rise in purpose, to love again without fear. And you will love again. Not because you need to prove your heart still works, but because you know your heart was never the problem. Your heart was the gift. The rare, grounded, powerful force that offered healing, presence, and connection. And while they may never find it again, you will, because you've become someone who protects it, who honors it, who doesn't hand it to the first person who smiles, but to the one who stands with integrity, who stays when it's hard, who tells the truth when it matters. That's the future you've built from the ashes of betrayal. A future forged not in pain, but in purpose. A life rooted not in avoidance, but in truth. You are not the victim of their betrayal. You are the author of your evolution. And that is the final chapter they will never get to read. Because your healing didn't just set you free, it sentenced them to the reality they created. A reality where your name echoes as both a reminder of their loss and a symbol of what they were never ready for. And that echo, long after you've moved on, will say what you no longer need to: you were the gift they couldn't keep. And now they know it. Fully. Quietly. Forever.